Everyone in town warned the grieving widow. They told her the mountain man was a beast, that he was too broken to be tamed, too dangerous to be trusted. But when she stood before the auction block, looked him in the eye, and bought his contract for a single silver dollar, he said something under his breath, something no one else heard, a single word that made her heart stop cold. They called him wild, and they had a reason. He hadn't spoken a single word the day the sheriff and his deputies dragged him into the town of Stone Red. His wrists were bound with thick rope, his beard was a tangled mess of briar and shadow, and a long, jagged scar ran from just below his ear all the way down to his collarbone. He walked like a caged animal, his eyes darting back and forth, like he was ready to bolt at any second, like he'd forgotten how to be among men. The stories about him were even wilder. Some folks whispered he'd lived up near the timberline, surviving winters that would kill a normal man. Others swore they'd seen him wrestle a black bear with his bare hands and walk away wearing its pelt. But one thing was certain. He hadn't come down from his mountain by choice. The town marshal had hunted him for 3 straight days through the treacherous pine gulches. The charge? Stealing a rifle from a passing wagon train? There was no bloodshed, no violence, just the theft. He'd taken the rifle and vanished back into the peaks, as if the laws of men were nothing more than a faint whisper on the wind. And yet there he stood. In the center of town, on a makeshift auction block, a splintered wooden sign hanging from his neck that read, "Work lease." He was barefoot in the midday sun, his head bowed, his eyes cast down, as if he were caught somewhere between this world and a much darker one. "Too wild," the town blacksmith muttered to his apprentice, shaking his head. "Ain't no man gonna train that beast. He'll snap a shovel handle before he digs a single trench." "Why not just lock him up?" someone else murmured from the crowd. "Jail's full to bursting," came the reply. "Judge figured if someone took on his work bond, it'd be a sight cheaper than feeding him through the winter." The townsfolk gathered like vultures drawn by the spectacle. A man who looked more grisly than human, put up for sale like livestock. They stared and they whispered, but no one dared to make a bid. And that's when they noticed the woman. She seemed to step out of the silence itself. Her name was Clara Hallow, and she wore the same widow's black dress she'd worn for the past year, ever since her husband, Daniel, was buried on the ridge overlooking their farm. Grief had carved itself into her face, leaving behind tired eyes and hands that trembled, but only when she thought no one was looking. Her voice hadn't risen above a whisper since the day of the accident. She walked straight through the parting crowd, her gaze fixed. Not on the auctioneer, not on the sheriff, but on the man on the block. She looked at him like she was the only person in the world who could see the man hidden beneath the wildness. The auctioneer, a portly man named Silas, blinked in surprise. "Ma'am," he stammered, "are you certain you want to—" "I'll take him," Clara said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the crowd's murmuring like a razor. "What's the bond?" A thick hush fell over the entire street. You could have heard a pin drop on the dusty road. Silas shuffled his feet, looking embarrassed. "Well, ma'am, the judge set it low, real low. He figured no one—" "Well, it's just $1. Without a word, Clara reached into the small satchel at her waist. She pulled out a single, shining silver dollar and placed it firmly in the auctioneer's sweaty palm. The deal was done. The sheriff, a gruff man named Dillard, untied the rope from the post and handed the end to her. It looked heavy in his hands, like he was passing her a burden, not a helper. "His name's Jonah," the sheriff said, though he didn't sound sure. "Best keep him close, Clara. Don't let him wander. We have no earthly idea what he's truly capable of." Clara didn't reply. She simply turned and began to walk. She walked down the main street, past the curious, judging eyes of her neighbors, and took the dirt road leading out of town. The mountain man followed behind her, the rope held loose in her hand. He moved like a shadow, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, a silent specter trailing a woman made of grief. But as she passed the last building just before the town gave way to open fields, he'd whispered it. A word so quiet, she almost thought she'd imagined it. A word meant only for her. He'd whispered her name. Clara. And her heart, which she thought had stopped beating a year ago, suddenly lurched in her chest, because no one had told him her name. The walk back to the farm was long and silent, the air thick with unspoken questions. Clara held the rope, but it felt useless. The man behind her wasn't a prisoner being led. He was a storm cloud following her, patient and ominous. He didn't ask where they were going, and she offered no explanation. They just moved, her worn boots kicking up dust, his bare feet leaving prints that seemed to vanish as soon as they were made. They walked past the dry well, past the little churchyard where her husband's name was still stark and fresh on a simple wooden cross. They walked out to the farm that had stood half-empty and silent ever since the storm that had taken Daniel from her. The barn roof still had a hole in it, a constant reminder of the chaos of that day. When they arrived, she didn't tie him to a post. She didn't bark orders at him or lay down a set of rules. She simply unlatched the big barn door, the wood groaning in protest, and gestured toward a corner where an old bedroll was tucked beneath a stack of hay bales. "You can sleep there," she said, her voice barely a whisper against the vast silence of the farm. He didn't respond. He just walked to the bedroll, sat down with his back against the rough-hewn barn wall, and placed his hands in his lap. He looked like he was waiting for something he didn't know how to name. Clara watched him for a long moment, then turned and went back to the house, locking the door behind her, a habit she'd picked up since being alone. That night, she made a thick potato soup, the same kind Daniel had loved. She poured a generous portion into a bowl, and after a long moment of hesitation, she left it on the ground just outside the barn door. When she woke with the sun, the bowl was empty. But it hadn't been moved. It was sitting in the exact same spot, licked clean. And so it began. This strange, silent pact between a woman who was trying to remember how to live and a man who seemed to have forgotten how to be human. He worked. He worked with a silent, relentless efficiency that startled her. He chopped a winter's worth of firewood in 2 days, the rhythmic thwack of the axe a new kind of heartbeat for the lonely farm. He moved through the fields with a mule's yoke on his broad shoulders, clearing stones with a strength that seemed almost supernatural. And one afternoon, she watched from the kitchen window as he climbed onto the barn roof and began to repair it, moving with a calm, steady patience that didn't match the wild animal the town saw. He fixed the roof with the same methodical pattern Daniel had always used. She felt a chill crawl up her spine. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. Still, he never spoke. Not a word. He would take the food she left for him, and in the morning, he would simply begin working again. She never asked him where he came from. She never asked about the stolen rifle or what had driven him from the high peaks. She only knew that the woodpile was growing, the fences were mending, and for the first time in a year, the farm felt less like a tomb. All she knew was the silence. Until the night the second storm came. It rolled in fast and mean, the wind howling like a legion of banshees, tearing at the new shingles on the barn roof. Clara rushed outside, her skirts whipping around her legs, the rain already soaking her to the bone as she tried to tie down a flapping wash line. Lightning ripped across the sky, illuminating the world in a flash of terrifying white. The thunder that followed was so loud, it felt like the mountains themselves were cracking open. And in that split second of chaos, he was suddenly there. He moved faster than she could comprehend, grabbing her arm with a grip like iron. He pulled her back, hard, dragging her under the meager protection of the porch awning, just as another lightning bolt struck the earth not 10 feet from where she had been standing. The ground sizzled, the air filled with the smell of ozone and burnt grass. She gasped, drenched and shivering, her breath caught in her throat. He was standing close, too close. His eyes, usually distant and clouded, were now fierce and clear, his jaw tight with an intensity that terrified and thrilled her all at once. The rain dripped from his matted beard, his chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, and then he whispered it. It wasn't a shout over the storm. It wasn't even a full sentence. Just 3 words, spoken so quietly, so reverently, that she almost missed them in the roar of the wind. Can't lose you. Her knees buckled. Her entire world tilted on its axis. Those were the words, the exact words, the last words her husband Daniel had whispered to her, his voice weak and fading as he lay pinned beneath the shattered axle of their wagon, the life bleeding out of him. No one else knew those words. No one. She had never told a soul. Not the doctor, not the preacher. They were a sacred, secret thing, belonging only to her and the ghost of her husband. She stared up at the mountain man, the thunder rolling around them, her breath frozen in her lungs. How? How could he possibly know? What did you say? She managed to stammer, her voice trembling uncontrollably. He just blinked once, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, as if he were waking from a long dream. He looked down at his hand, still gripping her arm, and quickly let go as if he'd been burned. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away from the porch, disappearing back into the driving rain, leaving her alone with the echo of a dead man's promise. Clara didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. She sat by the cold hearth, a thick wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The storm outside eventually passed, but a new one had erupted inside her. The words replayed in her mind, over and over. Can't lose you. It wasn't possible. It was a trick of the grief, a phantom sound carried on the wind. It had to be. But when the first light of dawn crept through her window, she knew something was deeply wrong. The usual sound of the axe splitting wood was absent. There was only silence, a heavy, unnerving silence. She pulled on her boots and rushed outside. The air was clean and crisp after the rain, but the farm felt empty again. Terribly empty. He was gone. And so was the mule. She searched the barn, her heart pounding with a frantic energy. His bedroll was still there, but it was cold. She ran to the field, calling his name, her voice sounding small and foreign in the morning air. She even scrambled down to the stream bed where Daniel used to fish, her mind racing. Nothing. He had vanished as completely as he had appeared. Had he run? Was he the fugitive the town believed him to be after all? Had it all been some cruel, elaborate lie? Then she saw it. There, etched into the damp earth beside the barn door, drawn with a stick, was a single, familiar image. It was a crude drawing of a sunflower. It made no sense. And yet, it made all the sense in the world. Because her husband had always done that. Whenever she was lost in her sorrow, after they buried the baby that never drew a breath, after she burned the bread, after she couldn't stop crying, Daniel would take her hand and draw a tiny sunflower on her palm with his finger. To remember the sun, he'd say softly. To remember all the good, Clara, even when you forget. She fell to her knees beside the drawing in the dirt. A sob tore from her throat, raw and painful. She wept for the first time in a year, not just for her husband, but for this wild, silent man who carried pieces of a life that wasn't his. Whatever this man was, he carried something that didn't belong to him. Or maybe it was something that had always, somehow, belonged to her. She wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. Her grief transformed into a burning resolve. The drawing wasn't a goodbye. It was a clue. It was a tether, a silent call for her to follow. She had spent the last year learning how to read absence. She knew the shape of an empty space at the dinner table, the feel of a cold spot in the bed, the silence where a footstep should be. She knew how to sense when someone had passed through and not come back. And this man, Jonah, had left a trail. She didn't hesitate. She saddled Daniel's old mare, the worn leather creaking a familiar song beneath her. She followed the faint tracks of the mule, a broken reed here, a scuff mark there, A few strands of coarse hair caught on a briar fence near the south hollow. The mare was nervous, sensing the shift in the air, but Clara pressed on, urging her toward the ridgeline where the trees grew thick and the mountain fog clung to the pines. Grief had taught her that very little in life made sense. You could be hanging laundry on a Tuesday afternoon, and the scent of soap on the breeze could send you spiraling back to a memory so sharp it stole your breath. You could touch the rough hand of a stranger and suddenly remember what it felt like to be loved so completely your soul felt borrowed. And maybe, just maybe, this stranger with storm-filled eyes and calloused hands had carried something borrowed too. She found the mule first. It was tethered peacefully beneath a giant fir tree near the Firewatch bluff, chewing patiently on a patch of grass. But the man was nowhere in sight. She dismounted, patted the mule's flank, and her eyes followed the trail of footprints leading up the steep incline of the bluff. Each step felt like she was winding a clock tighter and tighter. And then she saw him. He was sitting on the very edge of the cliff, his knees drawn up to his chest, his back to her. The sky stretched out behind him, vast and empty, the clouds hanging low as if they didn't dare get any closer. He looked like a man who had climbed to the top of the world just to see if he could find a reason to stay on it. She didn't call out his name. She just stood there, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, until he slowly turned his head. He didn't look surprised to see her. He didn't even blink. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said. His voice was quiet and husky, like an old engine that hadn't been started in a long time. She took a step closer, the ground feeling unsteady beneath her feet. "The sunflower," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You remembered." He nodded once, his gaze drifting back to the valley below, to her farm spread out like a patchwork quilt. "I dream things," he murmured, his voice laced with a deep, weary confusion. "Things that aren't mine. Faces I've never met. Names I don't know how to forget." Clara stepped forward, her dress brushing against the dry pine needles. "What kind of things?" He kept his gaze fixed on the valley. The sound of a baby's cry that never actually comes, the crack of a wagon wheel splitting, a man's hands, bruised and splintered from pulling beams that are too heavy. He paused, and his next words sent a tremor through her soul. And a woman, always a woman, weeping in a field of sunflowers. Clara's breath hitched. That field, behind the barn, it was her secret place, her sanctuary of sorrow where she thought no one, not even God, could see her. She had wept there for her lost child. She had wept there for Daniel. "Who are you?" she whispered, the question feeling enormous, impossible. He shook his head slowly, a profound sadness in the gesture. "I don't know anymore. The town calls me a beast, a thief. They say I ran from civilization, but the truth is, I think I was running from the noise in my head. Sometimes I see more than I should. I'll touch a fence post, and I'll know the name of the man who built it. I'll walk past a grave, and I can feel the sorrow of the one who was left behind." He finally turned to look at her, really look at her, and in that gaze, something flickered. It was recognition. It was pain. It was a deep, aching longing, as if the eyes he was using had once belonged to someone else, someone who had looked at her with love. "I didn't take that rifle to hurt anyone," he said, his voice raw. "I was starving. I was cold. I never wanted to come down from that mountain, but they hunted me." She knelt beside him on the edge of the world. The ache in her chest, the one she had lived with for a year, roared back to life. "You spoke my husband's words," she said, the statement hanging in the air between them. "I heard them in a dream," he whispered, his eyes distant again. Clear as thunder. A man was whispering, his mouth full of blood, and he was holding on to love like it was the last thing keeping him alive. Clara pressed a hand to her chest, trying to hold herself together. She had buried these memories so deep, she thought they could never be unearthed. "I never told anyone that," she confessed. "Not the doctor, not the preacher. It was just me and him, alone in that field, with the wagon tipped and the sky turning red. He didn't answer. He just sat as still as the stone beneath them, letting the silence say everything that words couldn't. After a long time, they walked back down the bluff together, the mule trailing behind them, two lost souls finding their way in the twilight. That night, Clara cooked again, cornbread and venison stew, rich with the scent of rosemary and juniper. But this time, she didn't leave the bowl at the barn door. She set two places at the small kitchen table. She pointed to the empty chair across from her, the one that had been empty for a year. And the wild man Jonah came inside and sat down. They ate in silence, the fire crackling in the hearth, the old clock on the mantel ticking away the seconds, just like it always had when Daniel was alive. It felt strange, and yet terrifyingly normal. As the meal ended, he spoke again, his voice soft. Daniel. Clara looked up, startled. What? My name, he said, looking down at his hands. I think. It came to me in a dream last night. You called me that, in the sunflower field, right before you kissed my forehead and said... He stopped, his brow furrowed in concentration. Clara's spoon clattered onto her plate. Her heart was beating so fast she felt lightheaded. Said what? She breathed. He finally met her eyes, and his were filled with a borrowed sorrow. You said, don't forget the taste of spring. The tears came then, hot and fast, spilling down her cheeks before she could stop them. That was it. The last thing she had whispered to their stillborn daughter before they took the tiny, perfect body from her arms. A phrase her husband had whispered to her every single spring when the first wildflowers began to bloom. A private promise, a secret language of their love, one no one else in the world had ever heard. You're not him, she said, her voice shaking, half accusation, half desperate plea. You can't be. He nodded slowly. I know. But you remember things only he could know. He nodded again, looking just as lost as she felt. I don't know how. She shot up from the table, pacing the small cabin, her breath tight in her chest. The room felt like it was closing in on her, the shadows on the walls stretching into menacing shapes. Did someone send you? She demanded, her voice rising. Is this some kind of trick? A cruel, twisted joke? No, Jonah whispered, and the pain in his voice was genuine. I swear to you, Clara, I wish it were that simple. She spun to face him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then what are you? She cried out. A ghost? A vessel for his memories? Are you possessed by my husband's soul? He didn't flinch from her anger. He just met her gaze with that unnerving, sorrowful calm. I'm just a man, he said quietly. But your pain, your memories, for some reason they've become a part of me. I feel them like echoes in an empty canyon, and I can't make them stop. Clara sank back into her chair, trembling from head to toe. It's not fair, she choked out. It's not fair to hear his words coming from another man's mouth. It's tearing me apart. I know, he said softly. Then why? She pleaded. Why do you say them? He looked at her then, and the sorrow in his eyes was so profound it nearly broke her in two. Because, he whispered, something deep inside of me, something that feels more real than my own skin, wants you to remember that you were loved. They sat there for a long, long time, the air thick with the impossible. Outside, the wind shifted, and a lone coyote yipped in the distant hills. Finally, Clara stood up and walked to the cabin door. She looked back at him, her face a mask of conflict and exhaustion. Come morning, she said, her voice raw. You can leave if you want. Your debt is paid. I won't stop you. He said nothing. He just watched her disappear into her bedroom and close the door. But when Clara woke the next morning, exhausted and emotionally drained, Jonah was still there. She looked out the kitchen window and saw him in the yard, splitting firewood with a steady, powerful rhythm, the sweat glistening on his brow like a man who had finally found a place where he belonged. And that, more than anything else, terrified her. For the next few days, Clara lived in a state of suspended reality. She watched Jonah from a distance. From behind the lace curtains of her parlor window, her heart a tangled mess of fear and a fragile, terrifying hope. He worked with a quiet discipline that was an uncanny echo of her husband. The way he handled an axe, the precise line of his shoulders as he walked the fence row, the gentle patience he showed with the stubborn old mule. It was all Daniel. It scraped her nerves raw. It wasn't just how he moved, though. It was what he seemed to know. He never pried. He never asked about the 2 wooden crosses on the hill behind the house, where wildflowers had now grown thick and tangled. He never questioned why the door to the small nursery at the end of the hall remained permanently locked. He never touched her, though sometimes his eyes would linger on her face with a look of such profound, familiar grief that she had to turn away. It was like living with a ghost who had forgotten he was dead. The town, of course, hadn't forgotten about her purchase. The whispers followed her like her own shadow. When she went to the dry goods store for flour, the conversations would stop, only to start again in hushed tones behind her back. "Clara Hallow's gone and bought herself a man," they'd say, their eyebrows raised in judgment. "The wild one. Dangerous, they say." Some days, Clara wanted to scream. She wanted to throw open her front door and shout at the top of her lungs, "He's more gentle than any of your husbands have ever been." But she didn't. She held her silence like a shield, went about her business, and let Jonah sleep in the hayloft where Daniel once kept his saddle gear. She let him work. She let him stay. And every so often, when she'd walk into the barn and hear him humming one of Daniel's old tuneless folk songs under his breath, she'd have to hurry back to the house before her legs gave out from under her. One evening, she was standing at the edge of her vegetable garden, staring at the ruin. The tomato cages were bent and rusted, the lettuce had bolted, and weeds had choked out everything else. It was a perfect reflection of her life, once tended with love, now left to wither. Jonah came up beside her, so quietly she didn't hear him until he spoke. He was wiping dirt from his hands with an old rag. "You planning on saving any of this?" he asked gently. She shook her head, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I gave up on it. The soil, it felt like it turned sour after he died. I tried that first spring. Nothing would grow. It was like the earth itself was grieving, too." He knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate. He pressed his palm flat against the dirt, closing his eyes as if he were listening for a heartbeat. After a long, still moment, he looked up at her, his gaze steady. "Let me try." She blinked. "Why would you do that?" He didn't answer right away. He just looked from the dead garden to her tired face. "Because," he said finally, "something tells me you need to see things grow again." And so she let him. For the next week, he worked that patch of earth like a man possessed by a gentle spirit. He dug deep, turning the soil, mixing in compost from the pile behind the barn. He pulled every weed with a careful hand. He planted seeds with a reverence that was almost painful to watch. It was the same method Daniel had used, the same quiet hum under his breath, the same unspoken respect for the land. She watched him from the porch, her heart tight in her chest, wondering how a man who couldn't remember his own past could so perfectly recall the rhythms of her husband's. And then the letter came. It arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a dust-covered courier on a tired gray mare. It was sealed with an imposing red wax seal and marked from a law office in Boise. Clara's hands trembled as she opened it at her kitchen table. The words swam before her eyes. A powerful mining company, Halloway Mining and Claims, had purchased the vast tract of land adjacent to hers, land Daniel had once considered buying, and now they wanted rights to her property as well. "We have reason to believe the primary mineral veins cross directly into your eastern pasture," the letter read. "We are prepared to make a generous financial offer for excavation rights." Clara's breath left her body. The eastern pasture. That was where she had buried it. Late one night, when the grief was a physical weight she couldn't bear, she had taken the cradle her husband had carved with his own 2 hands, the one their baby never got to use, and she had buried it deep in the earth, She couldn't stand to look at it, but she couldn't bring herself to destroy it either. That land wasn't just soil and grass, it was sacred ground. It was memory. With a cry of rage, she crumpled the letter in her fist and threw it into the wood stove. The flames devoured it in seconds. Later that evening, Jonah found her sitting on the back porch steps, her arms wrapped around her knees, her eyes red-rimmed and raw. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just crouched down beside her and waited. "They want to dig up the land," she whispered, her voice thick. "The part that matters." He still didn't ask. He just stayed quiet, a solid presence in the growing dusk. "I buried something out there," she confessed, the words tasting like ash. "A cradle, made from pine. His hands carved every inch of it. We never even got to place her inside." Jonah lowered his gaze. He looked at the ground, and for a moment, Clara saw a flicker of a memory, a true memory, his own, cross his face, a flash of pain and anger that was entirely his. "The baby," he said, his voice a low rumble. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. He stood up slowly, his tall frame blocking out the last of the fading light. "Then we won't let them take it." She looked up at him, her tear-filled eyes wide. "How can we possibly stop them? They're a mining company." "I'll find a way," he said. It wasn't bravado. It wasn't an empty promise. It was a statement of pure, unshakable conviction. He said it like a man who had already lost everything, and therefore had nothing left to fear. The next morning, before the sun had even crested the mountain, he was gone again. He'd taken the mule, a satchel with some jerky and water, and the deed papers to her land that she'd given him. He didn't say where he was going. He just touched the brim of the old hat he'd found in the barn, his eyes meeting hers for a long, intense moment, and promised he would be back. She waited. One day bled into two. By the third day, a familiar anxiety began to crawl up her spine, and she started pacing the length of the porch, her heart thudding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. By the fourth morning, she couldn't stand it any longer. She hitched the mare and set out after him, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She found him on the outskirts of town, standing near the county surveyor's office. He was speaking with a gray-haired man in spectacles, who was holding a large magnifying glass over an ancient-looking boundary map spread across a wooden table. Jonah turned as she approached, and a fire she'd never seen before was lit in his eyes. He looked energized, alive. "They never filed the proper mineral rights," he said, his voice breathless with excitement. "They just assumed their claim crossed onto your land, but the original survey from 50 years ago, it's off. It's off by 30 yards, the pasture, the cradle. It's safe. It was never on their claim to begin with." Clara stared at him, dumbfounded. How did you even know to look for that?" "I remembered," he said simply. He tapped his temple. "A voice, in my head, whispering about old pine markers buried near the ridge line that Daniel put there years ago. I spent 2 days digging, and I found them, the original boundary markers." She took a step closer, her voice barely audible. That voice, was it his? Jonah held her gaze, and the fire in his eyes softened into something warmer, something deeper. "No," he said quietly. I think it was yours." That night, after the sun sank behind the mountains and the air grew thick with the sweet scent of honeysuckle, Clara found herself sitting on the porch swing beside him. 2 mugs of chicory coffee rested on the railing between them. They didn't speak. There was no need. There was just the gentle creak of the swing, the chirping of the crickets, and the steady, quiet rhythm of 2 damaged hearts learning to beat in the same measure. After a long, comfortable silence, he finally spoke. "There's something else." She turned to him, her face bathed in the soft moonlight. "I saw your face before I ever met you," he confessed, his voice a low whisper. "In a dream. You were kneeling by a grave, whispering to the wind, and I knew deep in my chest that I had spent my entire life looking for you." Clara closed her eyes as fresh tears welled. "And I saw you too," she whispered back. "Or someone like you, a shadow in the mountains, A protector. I never thought you'd actually come. He reached out then, his movement slow, cautious, as if he were afraid she might shatter. His calloused, rough hand gently took hers. It was warm and strong, and it trembled just as much as her own. Neither of them pulled away, and as the stars broke through the clouds and spilled across the vast, dark canvas of the sky, they just stayed like that, hand in hand. The past and the present were colliding, right there on that porch, in a silence that said everything words never could. And for the first time in a very long time, Clara Hallow felt the undeniable stirrings of peace. But peace, she was about to learn, was a fragile, fleeting thing in a world full of men like Bernard Creel. The next morning, it rained. A slow, steady drizzle that seemed to wash the world clean, soaking into the thirsty earth like a gentle apology. Clara stood at the kitchen window, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, a warm mug clutched in her hands. She watched the raindrops trace paths down the glass, like tears she no longer needed to cry herself. She hadn't slept much, not because she was afraid, but because something fundamental inside her had shifted. Jonah had made her feel safe. It was more than his strength, more than his fierce protection of her land. It was in the way he listened, the way he simply sat beside her without demanding a single thing, the way he held her hand with a reverence that spoke of shared sorrows. He was quiet that morning, too. He sat on the edge of the porch, out of the rain, sharpening the old axe with long, methodical strokes. His jaw was tight, his eyes lost in the gray mist that clung to the mountains. She brought him a biscuit with blackberry jam, and he nodded his thanks, but he wouldn't meet her gaze. Something was brewing behind those storm-colored eyes, something he hadn't yet put into words. Later, when the clouds finally broke and a watery sunlight spilled over the hills, he saddled the mule. "I need to ride north," he said, his voice flat. "Just for a few days." Clara felt the air go out of her lungs. A cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. "Why?" "Something isn't right," he said, checking the mule's saddle strap. "That survey line. It's old, real old, and I keep hearing a voice. It's telling me there's more to find up there." "Whose voice?" she asked, her own voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, his hands stilling. "Yours," he said, finally looking at her. "But not. It sounds older, angrier." It made no sense, but she didn't try to stop him. She had learned to trust the strange currents that moved within this man. She just watched him ride off, the mule plodding slow and steady, until he disappeared into the wooded trail that led toward the base of the mountain. The next 3 days were an exercise in agony. Clara tried to keep busy, folding laundry that was already folded, sweeping a floor that was already clean. She found herself staring at the empty chair at her table, waiting. At night, the silence of the cabin pressed in on her, heavier than it had ever felt before. On the 4th night, just after sundown, a knock echoed through the cabin. Not Jonah's soft, hesitant rap, but 3 hard, impatient bangs. She rushed to the door, her heart leaping with hope, but it wasn't him. Standing on her porch was a man in a fine black coat, his beard trimmed like steel wool, his eyes as cold and hard as chunks of coal. 2 other men stood behind him in the shadows, their postures tense, their hands resting near the holsters on their hips. "Ma'am," the man said, tipping his hat with a gesture that was more mockery than respect. "Name's Bernard Creel. I represent Halloway Mining. We understand you've refused our very generous offer." Clara stood taller, her hand gripping the doorframe. "I burned it." Creel let out a short, dry chuckle that held no humor. "We admire your loyalty to this patch of dirt, truly. But the silver ore underneath your pasture is worth more than you'll ever make selling eggs and jam. I'm not interested." "No," Creel said, his smile vanishing. "You're not. But perhaps your new companion is." Clara stiffened. "You see," Creel continued, taking a step closer, "the man you bought off the block, Jonah, his name isn't Jonas. He's got a past, a long, messy one. Real name's Gentry Holt. Escaped from the Fort Shaw labor camp 3 winters ago. Wanted for a rather brutal assault. We've been looking for him for a very long time. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. You're lying. Creel's smile was thin and cruel. I wish I was. He's a wanted man, ma'am. Dangerous, unstable. Now, if word were to get out that a grieving little widow was harboring a violent fugitive, well, I'm not sure what the law would have to say about that. He let the threat hang in the air. But if you were to sign over the mineral rights to that pasture, we might just forget we ever saw him here. Her hands curled into fists. Get off my land. He tipped his hat again. Suit yourself, but don't say we didn't offer you a kindness. They left as the last sliver of sun dipped behind the hills, leaving a cloud of dust and a thick blanket of dread in their wake. Clara sank onto the porch steps, her mind reeling. Gentry Holt, a fugitive. Had it all been a lie? The shared memories, the gentleness, the protection? Was he just a con man, using her grief to his advantage? She was still sitting there when he returned at dawn. He was covered in mud and grime, his clothes torn, a wild, hunted light in his eyes. He dismounted slowly, favoring his left leg. She rushed to him, grabbing his arm. What happened? Are you hurt? Someone was following me, he gritted out, his voice raspy. Out near Bear Ridge. I thought I'd lost them. She helped him inside, her mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. She boiled water, cleaned and wrapped the gash on his leg. As she worked, he spoke quietly, his eyes on the floor. You had visitors. She looked up, startled. I saw the tracks, he added. 3 horses. One of the men wore expensive city boots. Bernard Creel. She nodded numbly. He told me your name isn't Jonah. He was quiet for a long, agonizing moment. Then he whispered, He's not wrong. Clara stopped, her hands frozen, the damp cloth held above his wound. What does that mean? He finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and filled with a terrible weariness. I don't remember everything. It comes in flashes like lightning in a dark room. But I remember Fort Shaw, and I remember a woman screaming. He saw the fear in her eyes and his voice grew desperate. I didn't hurt her, Clara. I swear to you. I ran because I couldn't prove that I didn't. She backed away from him slowly, a cold horror washing over her. I never laid a hand on her, he said, his voice louder now, pleading. They needed a body, a scapegoat for something that went wrong. I was the wild man with no name and no alibi. So I ran. Tears of betrayal and confusion pricked her eyes. Why didn't you tell me? Because for the first time in years I thought maybe I could start over, be someone new, be the man that Daniel was. She turned her face away, unable to look at him, but he pushed himself up, ignoring the pain in his leg, and stepped closer. I never meant to deceive you, Clara. I only ever meant to survive. Is that how you knew? She shot back, her voice thick with accusation. Is that how you knew where the boundary markers were? How you hummed his tunes? How you saw my dreams? He nodded, his face etched with pain. I can't explain it. I don't understand it. But when I'm near you, when I'm on this land, I feel him. It's like his memory slipped into my bones when mine was breaking, like I was meant to carry what he left behind, to finish what he started. Clara shook her head, pressing her palms to her temples. That doesn't make sense. Maybe not, he whispered, his voice cracking. But neither does me knowing how to repair your broken fence with the exact same knot your husband always used, or knowing that you kept a second jar of pickled beets hidden under the floorboards in the pantry, or hearing your name in my dreams for a year before I ever laid eyes on you. She stared at him, her heart shattering in places she didn't even know were still whole. This man was a walking contradiction, a violent fugitive who held her husband's gentlest memories, a dangerous stranger who knew her most intimate secrets. Then she whispered the words that felt like a betrayal to them both. You need to leave. He blinked, the hope in his eyes dying. Clara. If Creel is telling the truth, they'll be back, and they won't be alone. You have to go. I can't protect you from them. I'm not leaving you. You have to. Her voice broke. If they take you, you'll never come back from that camp. And I can't lose another man I care about on this farm. He stepped closer, his own eyes glistening. He gently took her face in his rough hands. Then let me fight for you, for this place, for him. Her hands came up to grip his wrists. How? We dig, he said, his gaze intense. Not for silver, for the truth. I think I found something up north, in the old camp records. A ledger, names, dates, times. If I can prove I was working on the outer perimeter the night that woman screamed. Clara's eyes widened. Then they can't touch you. He nodded. But I need time, and I need you to trust me. She didn't speak. She just closed her eyes, and then, throwing all caution to the wind, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his. For one long, breathless moment, there was no past, no mining company, no ghosts. There was only the quiet hum of two souls who had found each other in the vast wilderness of grief, clinging to one another as the storm gathered around them. That night, she couldn't sleep in her bed. She dozed in the rocker by the fire, holding a worn, crumpled page he'd managed to copy from the ledger. His handwriting was firm and sure. A single entry was circled twice. Gentry Holt, Site 3D. Logged in, January 3rd, 6 p.m. Logged out, January 4th, 6 a.m. The attack had happened on January 3rd, at 10:15 p.m., at the main camp, a full mile from where he had been assigned to work, alone. It was a start. It was a sliver of hope. But Clara couldn't have known that Bernard Creel had already ridden back to town, that he wasn't just talking to the sheriff. He was at the telegraph office, wiring a message. Not to Fort Shaw, but to a man far more dangerous than any lawman, a bounty hunter known only as Carter Vane, a man who didn't care about ledgers or alibis, a man who believed truth was measured in gold and justice was delivered from the barrel of a gun. And he was already riding their way. The morning broke with a deceptive calm, the air still and hushed, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Clara woke in the rocker, the copied ledger page clutched in her hand, the embers in the hearth glowing like malevolent eyes. The cabin was quiet, but her thoughts were a raging river. Gentry, she had to start thinking of him as Gentry, hadn't stirred from the cot she'd made for him by the fire. His leg was swollen, and the dark bruises spreading across his ribs spoke of a fight more brutal than he'd let on. He was breaking down, body and spirit, but he was still clinging to a thread of hope, a thread she had given him. She made coffee, strong and black, the way he liked it. He took the mug with a trembling hand, his eyes still closed. I need to know something, she said, her voice low. He opened his eyes, slow and weary. When you said those words, the ones Daniel used to say, how did they come to you? Exactly. He turned his face toward the fire. It's a sound first, like wind rushing through pine trees, but deeper. And when I'm near you, sometimes the sound turns into words. The first time I saw you, on that auction block, I heard a voice say it, clear as a bell. She don't talk loud, but the world itself goes quiet when she speaks. Her chest tightened. That exact phrase, not just the words, but the cadence, the rhythm. Daniel had whispered that to her the very first time she'd cried in front of him, years ago. Gentry had no way of knowing that. No one did. It scares me, Clara, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Because I don't know if I'm remembering, or if someone else is remembering through me. She reached across the small space and took his hand. It was feverish. Maybe, she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It doesn't matter anymore. Maybe what's real is what you do now. His gaze locked with hers, 1,000 unspoken things passing between them. But the moment was shattered by a loud, authoritative knock at the door. Gentry tensed instantly, his hand inching toward the rifle he'd propped against the table. Clara stood up, placing herself between him and the door, a silent protector. She cracked it open just enough to see, and her blood ran cold. Sheriff Dillard stood on her porch, his hat in his hand, a grim expression on his face. His deputy flanked him, and behind them were 4 horses. 2 of them were ridden by strangers, hard-faced men with rifles laid across their saddles. And standing beside the sheriff, wearing a smug, triumphant smirk, was Bernard Creel. "Clara," the sheriff said, his voice heavy with regret. "We've got some questions that need answering." "What kind of questions?" she asked, keeping her voice steady, betraying none of the terror that was screaming through her veins. "About the man inside," Creel answered for him, his voice sharp. "About the fugitive, Gentry Holt." Clara stepped fully onto the porch, pulling the door closed behind her. "His name is Jonah." Creel let out a harsh laugh. "No, ma'am, it's not. And your good sheriff here has a federal warrant to prove it." Sheriff Dillard shifted uncomfortably, avoiding her gaze. "I didn't come here to cause a stir, Clara. But if he is who they say he is, I have to take him in." "Based on what?" she challenged. "The word of a greedy mining company?" "Based on a warrant issued by the U.S. Marshals 6 months ago," Dillard said, finally meeting her eyes. "And what happens to him if you take him?" "He gets a trial," Dillard said, though he didn't sound convinced. "They tried to kill him once already," Clara shot back. "You think they'll stop now?" Creel stepped forward, his eyes like chips of ice. "We are prepared to be merciful. If you turn him over now, we won't press charges against you for harboring a fugitive." "You're a liar," Clara spat. "We'll take him regardless," Creel snapped, his mask of civility falling away. "But if you interfere, you will be arrested." "Let's all just calm down," Dillard said, raising a hand. But it was too late. The cabin door creaked open behind Clara. Gentry stood there, shirtless, the bandages on his ribs and leg a stark white against his skin. He held the rifle in one hand, its barrel pointed at the ground but ready. "She's not harboring anyone," he said, his voice a low growl. "I'm right here." Creel's smirk returned. "Well, that was easy." "No," Gentry said, taking a step onto the porch beside Clara. "It's not, because I'm not going anywhere without a real hearing, with evidence." "There is no hearing," Creel said coldly. "There's just a transport wagon and an empty cell waiting for you. Then you'll have to take me dead." The rifle came up, leveling at Creel's chest. Sheriff Dillard drew his own pistol, stepping between them. "Easy now, son. Nobody needs to get shot today." Gentry's gaze didn't waver. "Then tell them to leave." "I can't do that," the sheriff said, his face a mask of conflict. Clara stepped down from the porch, turning to face all of them, her small frame radiating a courage she didn't know she possessed. "I have evidence," she announced, her voice ringing with clarity. "A work ledger. It shows exactly where he was the night of the attack." Creel scoffed. "Fabricated, I'm sure, just like everything else about him." But Dillard's eyes narrowed with interest. "Let me see it." Clara rushed back inside, returning with the crumpled, copied page. She handed it to the sheriff with a steady hand. He read it once, then read it again, his brow furrowed. "If this is accurate," he said slowly, "he wasn't within a country mile of that attack." "It proves nothing," Creel protested. "There's no signature, no official seal." "No," Clara said, her chin high. "But I know where the original ledger is, and I'm willing to testify to that under oath." Dillard hesitated for a long moment, the fate of everyone on that porch resting in his hands. He looked from Creel's furious face to Clara's defiant one, and then to the wounded, desperate man with the rifle. Finally, he turned to his deputy. "Ride to the telegraph office. Get a wire to Fort Shaw. Ask them to confirm the logs for Site 3D for that date. We will delay this arrest until we get a response." Creel's face turned a shade of purple. "This is an outrageous waste of time, Dillard. You're obstructing justice." The sheriff calmly folded the ledger copy and tucked it into his pocket. "I'd rather be a fool than your kind of smart, Creel." He turned his gaze to Gentry. He doesn't leave this county, but he stays here under my supervision. I'll be checking in daily. Creel spat on the ground in disgust, then mounted his horse. He and his men rode off, their angry silence more menacing than any threat. As the last rider disappeared over the ridge, Clara felt her legs begin to shake. She slumped against the porch post, and Gentry was there in an instant, his arm around her, holding her up. "I thought you were going to let them take me," he said softly, his breath warm against her hair. "I almost did," she whispered back, her face buried in his bare shoulder. He helped her to the rocker and knelt beside her. "Why didn't you?" She looked at him then, her eyes wet with unshed tears. "Because," she said, her voice trembling, "something in me still believes you're more than what they say you are." He gently touched her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear. "I am," he whispered, "because of you." They sat like that for a long time as the sun climbed higher, two solitary figures clinging to a fragile truce. But miles away, in a dusty tent at the edge of the mining encampment, Bernard Creel was scribbling a letter by lantern light. It wasn't a request for information. It was an order, and it was addressed to Carter Vane. The bounty hunter wouldn't wait for a telegram. He was already on his way, a storm of violence galloping toward her door, with no interest in ledgers and no room in his heart for mercy.